Let It Go. This is an essay from 1971, and it's going to be discussed with James Valliant. James, thanks for being with us. What I want to do and what I like to do in every essay is, first of all, what is the context in which Rand is writing this essay? So we're 1971, and she's writing an essay mostly about the American sense of life. And it's a time where there is a sense of decline in the United States. The defeat in Vietnam is not yet official, but it's in the horizon. We're 2 or 3 years after the Tet attack. So the narrative that we're winning there is gone. We are during a time where the counterculture, the new left, has had a big impact within the US, mostly the youth and the middle classes. So there is a sense of decline. There is a sense of defeat in the air. And this is the time where Ayn Rand is intervening with this essay. So before we even get to this essay, what do you want to say about the context of Don't Let It Go?
Oh, you set it up very, very nicely there. There was a dramatic feeling that America was in the process of deep social change. There had been social movements before, the Greenwich Village Rebellion, the communists of the 1920s, and other movements before that. But the 1960s and 70s seemed to have a deep impact on American culture. One concrete that I can point to is, for example, American television shows, sitcoms. If you look at the shows in the 1950s and 60s, yes, they contain some conservative social values, but they also contain an entirely different set of psychological values, political values as well from the 1970s and 80s. There was a turn in American culture right then, and she noted it. And it very much had to do with the rise of the New Left, the violence on American campuses, the rise of the hippie movement. Across the board, and what was coming in the 1970s made her out to be something of a prophet, a giant economic stagflation, economic malaise, real crisis in American confidence after Vietnam and Watergate in particular. So she kind of called this, and she also kind of called what was the opposition to that, the real resistance to the social change that was going underway with the New Left, with the dramatic rise of the welfare state, with the war on poverty under Johnson, with the dramatic rise of these absurd altruist wars like Vietnam overseas. But yeah, at this point, America was in glorious doubt about the direction it was heading in, and the American middle class, their emotional response is mostly what it had going for it. Ayn Rand wrote this essay in 1971, a year before Nixon's landslide, which was I think mostly an American sense of life statement against McGovern's truly the first sort of overt socialist candidate for U.S. president, was thoroughly rejected in a giant landslide. And I think it mostly had to do with, one, the American middle class had a negative emotional reaction to the extremes of the far left, the militancy on college campuses, the lawlessness, and so forth. And I think the American middle class, in just a sense of life way, recoiled from it. A year after Ayn Rand wrote this essay, Ayn Rand was no big fan of Nixon. I mean, she thought he was a pragmatist, rotten guy. But you could see the American sense of life sort of still in existence, kicking out the idea of a real socialist like McGovern.
Good. So let's now dive. So we set the context. Let's dive in the essay. By the way, Robert, this is a brilliant question. Thank you for your super chat. We're going to address it at the end. So she begins with the 3 things that can project the future. So if you want to see where things are going, she says there are 3 things you need to take into account. Present course of action, your conscious convictions, and your sense of life. Now, what does this mean? The present course of action is, where are you now in life? Where are you going? For example, have you got a job? Have you got addictions that are destroying you? Are you overcoming them? Where are you in life? The equivalent in politics, in a big sphere, in the social sphere, is what are the politics? What is actually now happening? Your conscious convictions is what is, let's say, your ideology as a person. When it comes to society, it is what is the culture. And now we get to the crucial, the 3rd thing, which I need your help, James, here. the sense of life. And Rand describes sense of life as a subconscious appraisal of man and existence. Who I am and what is the world? Does the world make sense? Am I capable of operating it? Am I good? Should I pursue my happiness? She calls an unidentified philosophy, an unidentified philosophy. So, James, I understand how politics kind of tell you where you're going. I understand culture playing a role on where a nation's going. But what about sense of life? And sense of life makes sense to a person. But what is the sense of life of a whole nation?
Well, let's pick up right where you're going there, because Ayn Rand is, if I can use this term, I know it's controversial, but there's a context in here which really makes sense. Ayn Rand was a methodological individualist. It is true that there are certain things, that we cannot really even understand until we see people operating in groups. So long as Robinson Crusoe is alone on the island, the issue of politics or economics never comes up. He doesn't have a need for the concept of rights. He doesn't have a need for the concept of division of labor. It's true that people acting in groups, we need a new level of analysis sometimes. But the best way to understand society at large is to understand the individual. As to how an individual works will be the first order of business when we understand how a society works, because a society isn't some mystic entity. It is only the absolute collection of each and every one of those individuals. So what motivates an individual and how you judge an individual is how you judge, in effect, analogously, a culture, Ayn Rand says. And the first two you understand very straightforwardly. In a human being, Ayn Rand believed that emotions are shaped by our beliefs, by our cognition, by our thinking. And the broader our thinking, the more comprehensive its impact will be on our psychology. And so when it comes to the our most basic disposition towards the world, it boils down to philosophical ideas. But unfortunately, philosophical ideas that can only be subconscious, operating in a below the conscious, the self-conscious level, and affecting us in a purely emotional, psychological way. Just as for an individual, it is the most tenuous of all things, because it will be shaped by your philosophy and your actions, right? But this is true for a culture at large. Now, of course, we're dealing with large numbers of people and a lot of psychologies, a lot of different senses of life. So Ayn Rand is talking, when she talks about a nation or a culture, she's talking about the dominant ideas that are at least so dominant as that they're having an influence on the culture at large, even if they're not accepted by the majority. She points out that these things are driven and created by minorities. It is the minority that cares and thinks, as she points out, that really creates this for everyone else, because everyone else is busy being plumbers or electricians or doctors. And it's the intellectuals upon whom they're dependent. It's as if the intellectuals are sort of the mind here, and they're playing that role for society. So what we have to do is we can identify through the course of history, for example, in certain cultures, the dominant ideas and how they express themselves in the art, the politics, the culture of the time, the science of the time, the thinking of the time. And ultimately it comes down to philosophy. Unfortunately, sense of life can be totally maintained, whether we're conscious about it or not. We will have a subconscious integration at this level, and we will have a sense of life develop. It may be contradictory, it may be confused, but a sense of life will accumulate from the dominant ideas in a culture.
And the point that Rand is making is that you can have a bad culture that can be bailed out up to some point by a sense of life, and I would say also the other way around. I could, through introspection, this made a lot of sense to me. So when I was a Marxist, the one thing that saved me for becoming a complete shipwreck of a human being when it comes to values and all that stuff was, I think, a sense of life that I got very, very early, mostly from the stories that my grandmother was reading me about heroism, about resistant revolutions, like good revolutions, things like that. So somewhere, and also I liked movies where like the hero was an achiever and all that stuff. Like so that saved me. So on a constant level, I was like, well, yeah, everyone who achieves, they are frauds, or achievement means that you've cheated. But at the same time, I was like, wait a minute, then why do I have all this admiration for athletes or for heroes of the past? Well, this means that maybe achievement is possible, and maybe you should be that person rather than being someone who tries to drag other people down. So the sense of life somehow saved me.
What a wonderful example.
Yeah.
What a wonderful, because what you're seeing there is that your original better sense of life was developed by ideas that you either as a child or as a young person accepted or subconsciously accepted. They affected your emotions, but then when you got to school and learned from other people, you were, hey, communism sounds like it's okay, and it's, gosh, well, I don't really have an answer to that yet, but it conflicted with your emotions, with your sense of life, so that when you did hear better ideas, it was suddenly, that's what I knew there was something in my gut that was telling me there was something wrong with communism, and that can be a real healthy thing. And I've seen that with Americans, particularly. Ayn Rand is right about that. There are certain sort of premises that Americans sort of grow up with that they take for granted, that they know that, overt socialism and communism conflict with. And if they can see an error in communism, if there is a better alternative like an Ayn Rand or a better thinker who can come along and tell you why, no, those emotions were what was right, not what you later learned in school. Yes.
Could it also be the other way around? So, for example, we could say that Dominique, at least in the beginning of the Fountainhead, her ideas, like when she goes to bed, she knows what is good art. She knows to recognize a good building from a bad. But her sense of life is achievement is impossible. Everything. So this makes her, in a way, the person she is. So could we say that also your conscious convictions and your sense of life could be different, and your convictions could fix your bad sense of life? So first of all, do you accept that Dominique has a bad sense of life in the beginning of the novel, and that it's her conscious convictions that are saving her?
Exactly. That is exactly correct. She develops a bad sense of life because she develops this view of the universe and the capacity for the good or the great to succeed in that universe. And she develops a view that everyone else who doesn't appreciate it would just be sacrilege, would be corrupting it. So long as those ideas are motivating her psychology, her better subconscious ideas that make her appreciate good architecture, that make her worship Howard Roark's art, are in conflict. She's got this psychological conflict between her sense of life about art, let's say, and her sense of life about the universe. And a sense of life it can be a contradictory thing, and it can be a tenuous thing until we ground it in our philosophy, until we understand which elements of our emotions are more consonant with reality.
And this is the bell that Rand is ringing, that your sense of life is not going to bail you out forever, which is the first example that we gave. So then he says that while most men be indifferent to cultural or ideological trends, no man can escape the process of subconscious integration which forms his sense of life. And the obvious example here is, let's say you are not a conscious anti-capitalist, but you see in all the TV, all the films of the TV series, the capitalist is a bad guy. Or you hear things where people who aren't into philosophy bromize like, well, you can never know the truth. What's true for you is not true for me. So these are things that subconsciously influence how you view the world and influence even your self-esteem. So, for example, you know that you're right, but who am I to know if I'm right? So maybe I shouldn't speak. So, okay. So then she goes on to talk about the sense of life of the United States, which she considers unique and special. And she compares it with Europe. And she mentions the issue of servitude and service. And she says that notice that the American who joins the army doesn't consider himself a subject of the state. He's not the same as the Spanish phalangist who goes to die from Spain, or the German who goes to die for Germany. The American doesn't look forward to die for glory or for something. The American has this, she calls it, the generous aristocrat who chose a dangerous task. And you think about it even today, when you see, for example, the Navy SEALs, they even have this level of, even in their, how they look, they're, quote, more individualist. They don't have to save. So the idea is, look, we are the best fighters in the world and we take pride and we are here because we chose to. So this is the first difference between let's
Well,
say
you
the
know,
American and the European sense of life?
Americans have had a military conscription before. World War II, for example, the Civil War, for example. Those were the two great examples before Vietnam where America used military conscription. In both of those wars, it is clear that conscription was not necessary. The American people were lining up. Every healthy young man in the country was lining up practically. I mean, there was some small opposition, but basically the Americans were understood that the fight against slavery in the North, for example, or Americans understood that the fight against Nazism, right, and Japanese aggression was worth fighting for. When it came to Vietnam, that's there we had an experience with conscription which people, both Republicans and Democrats, resented. How can you send a bunch of young people against their will to die in some foreign jungle where it's not clear they even know what they're fighting for? Now there was white, and that is what caused in the 1970s, in the wake of Vietnam, Republicans helping to lead the charge against having any military conscription and outlawing it. So, yeah, Americans have, I know in my own family, for example, that was the case. Well, I have three uncles who fought in Korea, and I have my valiant grandfather fought in World War I. They were all volunteers who believed in the cause. I'm not sure I believe in the cause of World War I, but they were all volunteers who believed in the cause that they were fighting for and proud to have joined up.
And even I remember, even in Greece, although we had the dictatorship when the Italians attacked in 1940, if you see the videos or if you hear our grandfathers, they rushed, where is the closest place where I can enlist? Because this idea is this is a just war. This is an issue of my own pride that I want to resist, let's say, this regime. Thank you very much, Jonathan and Jeff, for your generous contributions. It's so nice that it's not only that people get value even for this, that someone will call, quote, abstract discussions. They're not abstract discussions, because the point is, how can we distill what is relevant for our life? And we really appreciate that you people are getting value from this. Okay. Then, the other thing that she mentions is the difference towards how we view wealth. How the Americans view wealth, where they say, oh, you made money, good. And how the Europeans consider it crude or disreputable. But notice something interesting. Not when it comes to old money. Europeans, when they see old money, it's like, oh, I mean, even communists in Greece, like they have more this kind of respect to, okay, these are the old aristocrats, but they're the vulgar, or they have these fancy cars, and you don't get that in America. So do you wanna say something about this, like the different sense of life when it comes to money, and why is it a sense of life issue?
There's 1,000 examples from European culture. European aristocrats have looked down their noses at professional people, middle-class working people for generations. As if it's crude, as if actually earning a living and making it on your own. Whereas if your ancestor stole it by some war at the point of a sword, and you inherited it from some distant ancestor, that somehow that is a better moral reflection on you, as opposed to, say, you as an individual, your hard work, your creative thought actually doing it. Americans, with their experience under freedom, throughout the 19th century and so much of the 20th century, understood that people, no matter where they came from, the poorest people who were born to illiterates in log cabins, could become highly educated presidents of the United States like Abraham Lincoln. That totally self-made people like John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie, who emerged from total poverty, could become the richest men in the world if they provided petroleum or steel, a value that was needed by the world so badly right then. They could understood that it was Henry Ford and Thomas Edison's creative thought and hard work that increased the productivity of American industry and eventually worldwide industry so much greater than it had been before because of their inventions. Now, Americans understood the relationship between hard work, creative thought. They understood most people could make it on their own if they tried. They understood that initiative mattered. They understood that people from, no matter what context they came from, I mean, some of our immigrants came from the most dire poverty and horrible oppression in the countries from which they came, and yet within a generation, they were wealthy, well-to-do, educated Americans. So American experience taught Americans a great deal, as well as our founding ideas, that each individual has an equal right to pursue his happiness, that there's nothing
So
wrong with you pursuing your own life. The way I was raised by my parents is a classic case in point. As a teenager, I would express a value for something. Gee, I want to have a car. My parents would say to me, well, what are you going to do that? To get that? I know you want that. What a cool thing to have. So what is your plan to acquire that by your effort? Because really, that's all you can rely on. There's nothing, there's no gift from the state, there's no entitlement, and certainly your parents and your ancestors aren't going to be the source kid. So that was the American idea, really. I grew up with it.
So let's help, first of all, help myself because it's not 100% clear to me, but also maybe our viewers. How is this a sense of life and different from, let's say, the culture? Why is this idea that, yeah, you need to make your money your own way and it's achievable and you're good if you do it? Could you elaborate with as simple words as possible? Why is this a sense of life issue?
It has to do with whether or not man is capable of achieving his values on earth. For Ayn Rand, that is one of the most basic metaphysical questions that shape our sense of life. Two things, really. A benevolent view of the universe. Are my values achievable in this universe? Or is this universe hostile and dead set against me? And no matter how much virtue I exhibit, no matter how much thought or creativity, I'm just doomed to failure in most cases. Well, if you have that malevolent sense of life, you are going to feel hopelessness. You're going to look for a leader. You're going to be psychologically dependent. If, on the other hand, you believe that the universe is benevolent, at least in the sense that values can be achieved, you're going to have a whole different approach. Americans pursued life like those who understood that the world was theirs to improve, to reap values from. It was there for them. And the other thing is self-esteem. Do you think you're worthy and able? Americans developed this amazing sense of self-possession. Yeah, I don't care what you say. I can make it on my own. Just leave me alone. I know that I can do something. I know I can improve my life at least if you all just leave me alone. That kind of don't push me around. I love that line Ayn Rand uses here. It is a classic American phrase, a phrase that every individual really who possesses the American sense of life still, and that is a declining thing we need to talk about, but those who still possess the American sense of life have that attitude. How dare you push me around, whether you're a criminal or whether you're the government? And some of, for example, the COVID restrictions have been resisted by Americans in a very emotional way. They're out there demonstrating in the streets, and you can see there's sort of a spark still of American sense of life there. No, you don't have a right to tell me I can't live, open my business, have a backyard barbecue. You don't have that right. Stop pushing me around.
And we're going to see when this can go south, when it's not accompanied by the right philosophy. But something that came to my mind while you were saying this, your convictions on something can change fast. The sense of life or sense of life level things are way slower. An example is self-esteem. So it took me like 2-3 months to understand that Marxism is not good. And when I was reading Austrian economics, I said, yeah, okay, obviously this economics makes more sense. The idea that your life is yours and you shouldn't apologize to anyone. This was such a slow burner, like years, and it's still a thing in process. Now, it's difficult to say, is this a sense of life thing? Is this a philosophical conviction thing? But it's a level that takes more time to change either the one direction or towards the other direction.
Right. Are you living for the German fatherland and the Aryan race? Are you living for the future of the fantastic future of the stateless society in which all men are supermen, like Marx predicted? You know, that is really, I think, Ayn Rand as a European was very much more. She grew up in a European context, was educated at a European university, and back in the early 20th century. So she brought to it a specific context of understanding European culture. The kind of culture that she's talking about, I guess, could be seen in maybe there was a popular British TV show recently called Downton Abbey, where it showed English people, ordinary English people in the first decades of the 20th century. And it's not only old lady Grantham, the grandma aristocrat, it's also the servants, the butler, and other servants who are keen on knowing their place, knowing where they fit, who they serve, what are they serving. And it's knowing their place that's far more important to them than controlling their own life, being the master of their own destiny, getting what they want from life. Again, I repair to my parents. They raised my sisters, my brothers, all to think your happiness is what matters. What's going to make you happy? Forget the world. Find the job that makes you happy. Find the person that makes you happy and marry them. Your happiness, your fulfillment is all that matters. Nothing could be contrasted more. Now, I like to think that the European sense of life may have changed a bit since then. I like to think that America may have had, just as European intellectuals have had a profound effect on me, Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises, so I hope that the American sense of life, at least, has had some feedback on Europe, to some extent at least, and many of my European friends do not share the attitude Ayn Rand had, but I'm kind of biased because many of my European friends are admirers of Ayn Rand. On the other hand, it is the slower thing to change, a psychology. But the proviso is it will change, and it will be controlled and dominated by the dominant philosophy. It is culture, in particular philosophy within culture, that will set the agenda and in the long run cannot be resisted. A psychological sense of life is the slowest thing to change, but it can change, and what changes it is philosophy. And unfortunately, within my lifetime, reaching now just about my 58th birthday, I've been able to see the American sense of life, unfortunately, decline and change since Ayn Rand was writing.
So let me make sure I get this right. So the difference between philosophy and sense of life is philosophy's conscious convictions, whereas sense of life is how do you incorporate them subconsciously, like on your, quote, instinctive reactions, on your thought, that you, on your emotions, for example. Emotions are automatic, but of course you can stop and check them. So is this the difference between philosophy and sense of life?
That's exactly the difference. That's exactly the difference. Emotions may be slower to change in individuals, but what changes them is philosophy over time.
And here's another very good example that Rand is giving. So she talks about this issue of how do you react when it comes to initiative. And she says, notice how the Americans, their characteristic is, okay, what do we do now? How do I fix this when something goes? Whereas the European waits and stares around and says, who is the person in charge? But Rand herself figured out that it doesn't take long for a new type of human being that hasn't got this initiative. And the example that comes to mind is the scene with the frozen train. Just before Dagny, spoiler alert for Atlas Shrugged, by the way, put the volume down. Just before Dagny leaves for and takes the airplane to chase Quentin Daniels to what proves to be Atlantis. So when the train is frozen, all the passengers, just the one stares at each other. And Dagny thinks, oh, this is the new men who only have expectations and they can't take the simplest initiative. But this initiative, Rand recognizes as part of the American sense of life. So we see that it can get lost, but when Rand is writing, already still in 71, she still thinks we're not yet in an Atlas Part 3 world.
As a teenager, I worked in an American factory, and I saw this firsthand. When Ayn Rand explained to me the factory experience in Great Britain, I was dumbfounded. You mean they wait around? They wait around? They're going to stop production? My production is going to slow? My output is going to slow until we get the... No. We're going to figure this out ourselves. Who's on this? Someone's going to be on this. I saw this again operatively in my own life as a kid. My dad is an engineer. And so he loves to fix things, knows to fix things. But if a neighbor had a problem, there's something wrong with, the plumbing in my house or my car, my dad was over there just to help them. You don't need to wait for some insurance company. You don't have to wait for some, what are we waiting around for? We're going to fix the problem. If we can fix the problem, let's fix it now and get on with it. There's an extremely practical attitude. I'll tell you, though, the downside of it, my dad also represents an important thing that Ayn Rand is talking about the Americans of her time. He went into science. He went into technology. He went into business. When I told him that I was going to study philosophy and history at university, he was not He was not excited. Why would you study nonsense like that? Why would you study BS like that? Everything I hear about coming out from the humanities departments in universities seems like a bunch of nonsense and crap to me. Why don't you do something real, he would say, and become a businessman or an engineer or at least a scientist and discover new knowledge, or a doctor who can cure people. Americans have a very practical, hands-on, let's get it done attitude. And that came at the expense of dismissing philosophy because it was, to their way of thinking, a bunch of nonsense. But that was their mistake. It is philosophy that will, in the long run, determine who wins and loses these battles.
Exactly. And then she mentioned something that for me really clicked it. Another difference. She says the Europeans live emotionally in a world which is made by others. And the mere fact that it is made by others and it's been like that, you have to respect it. Why? Because, and you need to know your place. Let me give one particular example. My village in my mother's father and mother village in Crete. Maybe not even today, but till, let's say, 10 years ago, it would be weird for a woman to walk, for a married woman to walk towards the central square, unaccompanied by a husband or a cousin, a male, like not like Taliban style, like no one would say, but it would be weird. And weird, first of all, inside here. And when you'd ask, like, come on, why do you have to do this? Says, well, that's how it's done here. We have to respect it. Not checking, do I respect it because it makes sense? No, but it's been done like that. Others have done it. And Rand contrasts this with the American attitude is best, quote, expressed by a line from a poem. The world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win. This is the Westerner by Badger Clark. So this is the contrast between, well, it's been done like that versus, no, I make my own world.
And Westerns and American studies, stories about business from the older ones are really the place to see this. Look at Westerns. Look at both movies, television shows, books. Look at the way America looked at the Old West. This is an untamed wilderness. It needs to be civilized. And it's only going to be civilized to the extent human beings bring civilization and order to it. It is a fresh world that we can create on our own. We will make the new rules. To quote Shakespeare, we are the makers of manners. And we're going to do it right, darn it. That was exactly, and for Westerns to sort of be the American myth, the great mythology of America, tells you a great deal about the American sense of life as it existed in the first 200 years of its existence. The individual and the capacity of the individual, and all of this is decided at the individual level. And it's our capacity to bring order and civilization to the West, to turn this wild landscape into something more amenable to human life, into the farms and cities and businesses that now California is now on the edge of the space age, cutting edge technology in California when it was Stone Age a mere 200 years ago, and I'm not exaggerating. That notion of remaking a continent, I think, has an indelible impression on the American sense of life. Individual freedom is what makes the difference, and it will bring civilization, tame a West, if you will.
And of course, notice how today the attitude is, we need to feel guilty about all that. We need to feel remorse like we did. Now, taking aside all the injustices towards particular, let's say, Native Indian tribes, but yeah, the overall narrative is we messed up with things as they were, as if this is something wrong. But
I have no doubt that there were injustices all over the place, in many cases with Native Americans, any more than I have no doubt that the British in India were often violent and abusive of their rule. But when I look back on it, the British Empire, it wasn't the British Empire that got most out of that deal, but the Indian subcontinent that was civilized and got far more out of, it's nothing race, it has nothing to do with race. It was the Indian subcontinent that got more intellectually, culturally, economically from their interaction with Great Britain than had Great Britain ever gotten raw materials from the Indian subcontinent. And I think the same has to be understood with Native Americans. They were never going to have a burst of freedom. America is what brought civilization and individual rights practically to North America. So,
yeah, that's a difficult. So, for example, I can think of Cyprus, where again you could say part of its progress is that it comes from that it has this infrastructure from the British. At the same time, they were hanging. And they were an oppressive rule, but anyway, let's leave this for another.
I'm not saying that Victorian England was perfect, and I'm not saying that America was always perfect when dealing with the Native Americans. That's all.
No, okay. And again, we've had the whole discussion.
Yes, we've discussed those things before,
yeah.
Right?
Okay, so we talked about, and then she has this beautiful line. Says it was quote, it was a European who discovered American, but it was Americans who were the first nation to discover the earth and man's proper role in it. So okay, here's another thing though that I didn't really, one of the things that I didn't get in this essay. So at some point she says, American has never had an original culture, a body of ideas derived from her philosophical Aristotelian base, and expressing a profound difference from all other countries. If America never had an original culture, what about Hollywood? What about jazz, the roaring 20s, even rock and roll? Isn't this an original culture?
Oh, America had many in fact, Ayn Rand discusses some of the superficial ways. In fact, the quote you just had there showed some differences, some real differences between the dominant American psychology and the dominant European one, right? Americans have this whole different attitude about the role of the individual and his possibilities. There you can actually see this in full operation. So America had, unique music, jazz for sure. A unique kind of musical, the Broadway musical. Absolutely. You could look, I was just discussing the Western. Look at our film. We developed a whole new art form, film and television, invented here. So America, and if you look at certain aspects of American culture, let me give American culture its due. When you look at certain aspects, especially as you go back in time, there was an American style of writing, very different from the British style of writing. And you could see it in developing in Mark Twain and so forth. A clean, efficient, scientific, precise, and get right to the point kind of style. A sleek, efficient literary style was developing in America. Absolutely. Even some of the ideas were far more individualistic than ideas coming out of Europe, whether they were from our philosophically dubious transcendentalists or from a poet like Walt Whitman. Better culture was expressing itself. But what Ayn Rand means by culture there, Nikos, most fundamentally is philosophy. That first quote from her that you had, America never had a philosophy to defend its unique perspective on things. And so American culture, all the best parts of American culture have been slowly dying for lack of oxygen, if you will, ideological oxygen that can only come from philosophy. America needed Ayn Rand. America needed a systematic defense of her political system, of her sense of life, on a philosophical ground. Political philosophy, moral philosophy, most particularly, and the epistemology upon which a sound moral philosophy is based, Aristotle. They needed to understand their glory. And the idea, see, this is what a sense of life can't do. A sense of life only gives you an emotion. It doesn't allow you to defend those emotions over time. For that, you need ideas, critically. The ideas that will defend that sense of life. And those come from philosophy. So the critical part of culture that America missed from Ayn Rand's perspective was philosophy. What from American pragmatism was just, like she points out, a bunch of rehashed German philosophy, right? A bunch of guys who read some transcendentalism and some Hegel and did their American version of it with pragmatism. That's the closest thing to an original American philosophy we've had. But come on, it's recycled German philosophy, as Rand points out. What America desperately needed was objectivism.
And here she gets to the point why this is a problem. Because there's a sense of life is not a substitute for explicit knowledge.
Exactly.
And she says that you can lose it if you don't translate your self of life to explicit ideas and values, then you're in trouble. Here's an example.
Yeah.
She talks about common sense and how the American industrialist has common sense. Common sense is a good defense to bullshit. But that's as far as it can get you. Let me give you an example. What happened when the woke mobs, I don't like the term woke, the mobs took over universities and they wanted to deplatform? We said, and many people said, that's crazy. That doesn't make sense. But how, common sense, but how did the battle for free speech evolve? Oh, free speech is common sense. Oh, Twitter is deplatforming our people. Therefore, this is against free speech. Common sense. We need to force Twitter to get back Trump or see common sense, which is, let's say, a sense of life. Like, what are these crazy lefts are doing? Without explicit ideas and principles, it's not gonna take you far.
Even our better right-wing, sometimes friends really are lacking in this department, aren't they? They will often get confused. They will often you'll take a Republican governor like DeSantis in Florida. He'll do all kinds of wonderful things, recognizing, for example, that the COVID lockdowns were too much. But then he'll impose restrictions on private businesses and whether or not they can have vaccines or require vaccine passports or require testing and so forth. That's a private company. And so here again, even a Republican who's a strident defender of individual freedom and says the COVID restrictions have gone too far, even he doesn't have a philosophically consistent set of ideas. And so bad ideas smuggle their way in once he gets an emotional gist about the COVID overreaction. See? That is absolutely correct. A sense of life will create contradictions, confusions, and in the end will break down under the more consistent ideas dominant in your culture.
So we have to translate it specific in explicit ideas and values. For example, sense of life. It's important to work, it's good to work. Specifically, work on your own initiative, first and foremost for yourself and your own values, and you don't need someone's permission to do so. And this is what distinguishes the martyr, which is, let's say, the hardworking person in Greece who need to give 60% of their income to the government, to the person who understands why it is important. It's not important in a rationalist way because working is it's not like the Soviet thing, the workers. No, it's important because I put my values into action, I translate my ideas to real life, and I try to make my life happen. I have a purpose and I'm going through this. So that's the difference between, okay, I kind of get it, versus this is how I'm going to be happy in my life.
That's it. That's it. So much of American culture was, for kids, what are you going to be when you grow up? I was asked so many times when I was a kid. So many times when I was a kid, what would you be when you grow up? And sometimes I'd inquire as to why they were inquiring. Well, because you can do anything you want. What do you want to do? What do you think needs being done? What do you enjoy doing? What would fulfill you? You need a purpose. And it's you define your purpose. That was the assumption as I was growing up. What do you want to do, Jimmy, when you grow up? Because your happiness is what matters. The fact that you needed a purpose, a personal, individual purpose that will distinguish you from all the rest of us is what makes you an individual and makes you valuable and will make you happy. That was the implicit philosophy in America that I am fortunate enough to have grown up with.
And you mentioned COVID. So Rance's defiance, and this is a quotable line, defiance, not obedience, is the Americans' answer to overbearing authority. Notice, though, again, if you take this out of its proper context, you can end up in a Texas situation which says we need to force businesses to drop their vaccine mandates because defiance is the thing. Without saying, okay, define defiance, understand and make it explicit. If you don't make it explicit, you can fall victim to this healthy reaction to this authoritarianism, and then you also do things that
it so easily creates a package deal. I believe that, at least under most circumstances, getting the vaccine is a good idea. I don't believe that the government should be able to force vaccines. But if I say I got vaccinated on Facebook, suddenly 100 different people, some of whom say they were influenced by Ayn Rand, many of whom claim to be defenders of individual liberty, are saying, well, you're wrong for getting vaccinated because the government is recommending it, and the government is issuing these passports, and the government is going to force us to do things if we're not vaccinated. No, 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 no. My health decision is my health decision, and I'm going to make it on my own rational basis. It's not going to be made because I'm having some emotional reaction to some government mandate.
And these guys, if you think about James, they're second-handers. Because there are two ways to be second-hander. The one is I do what others tell me. The other is the contrarian. The contrarian says, whatever the others are saying, I'm doing the opposite. Irrespective. Is it good for me? I don't care.
I don't care. See, it's this kind of package deal that a sense of life might push you into, but careful thought would make the proper distinctions regarding.
Okay. Dylan, if you can tell me when is the next when is the next episode to see if we can go even 1-2 minutes over time. Thank you very much, Christopher, for your super chat. And I want to let 5 minutes at the end for Robert's question because it's a brilliant question. Okay, so then she talks about another difference, which for me is also the most interesting, is actually the most interesting one. 9 p.m. UK time. Okay, I'm not good in maths. Can you tell me, because I'm not in the UK, can you tell me how many minutes this is? Is it like 10 minutes or is this 60 plus 10 minutes? Okay, so she says there has been basically no American proletariat. So the American worker doesn't see himself as, 60 plus. I'm not good in maths. So the American worker does not see himself as a proletariat. And why is this important? Because it gives you a pride in your work. You work and, for example, you have a small house. That's why I'm very, very skeptical of this, how to call it, millennial hipster. Oh, we're not going to own anything. We're going to take Uber, but no one's going to have a car. The idea of property, I mean, this is a bit of a conservative notion, but the idea of property roots you in a way in your life in terms of, okay, I have something to defend and freedom matters in a way which is more than if you're just this nomad who is like, well, I don't own anything and I don't care. So I found this very, very interesting that maybe because of this idea of I have my house, my car, the American worker is prouder. The American worker is not, I'm just a proletariat. I can only look forward to the revolution.
Yeah, there's that great saying that there are really no poor Americans. There are only millionaires under temporarily bad circumstances. The thing about the American labor movement as opposed to the European labor movement through the 20th century was how the European labor movement embraced socialism so explicitly and was willing to work early on with the Soviet Union, very early on. The American labor movement was most definitely not like that. American communists in the 1920s and 30s had a hell of a time because American labor unions didn't want to cooperate with the Soviet Union. They didn't buy socialism outright. And that has been a major problem. Fast forward to today, so much of, say, Mr. Trump's support came from the working class. Came from working class, formerly Labor Democrat people. It's true that Trump had changed Republican policies on tariffs and on immigration, two issues that labor unions always were messed up about, right? But nonetheless, the Republicans, the American working class, is finding these days much more comfortable under the Republican Party in many cases. It's a very funny thing. My entire maternal side of my family were all labor union members, all working class, what we used to call labor Democrats. All of them but one were ferociously anti-communist. All of them but one still had this, hey, an individual has a responsibility here. What are you doing here? What are you doing for yourself? Why aren't you working for a living there? That kind of attitude. Even though they were card-carrying American labor union members. They had a very negative view of socialism. They had a very positive view of individual effort. And they rejected any help from the Soviets through the 20th century, unlike many labor movements in this world. So yeah, Ayn Rand makes a really good point there. Even the American working class certainly the American middle class, never bought into socialism as such, as an idea.
Let me say something with my this is not objectivist. This is my view, right? I would dare to say, even in Greece, working class people who were actually communists, because their sense of life was more this idea of the working class hero that you go wake up early and you go to work, they are less corrupted than the middle class intellectuals who were leftists but not communists.
So the communists would say, Nikos, along those lines, the Fountainhead movie comes out in 1949, right? It gets released in Great Britain. The critics don't like it. Rich people don't like it. Guess where it's popular? Among the working class. It's in labor districts. The Fountainhead film turned out to be popular in Great Britain.
And at that time, when we're talking about labor working class districts, we mean people who were actually also politically radical for the left. But in a different, like the old left and the new left, there's a definitely different sense of life. And this is why it's the difference between a Taganov and a Pavel Sierov. And again, not every communist is a Taganov, and at some point there comes a point in your life where if you're a Taganov, you can't be a communist anymore. But there is a sense of life element there. Okay, let's proceed though, because Jeff, thank you so much for your super chat, and thank you so much for your kind words. I'm very touched by that people support this. So, okay. So let's wrap it up. And what he says at the end then is that, and two things before we go. The one is that fundamental guilt, and when it says fundamental, I think it means existential, like metaphysical, as we say. It says existential guilt, fundamental guilt is making people easy to rule. And that's very important. It's as if some type of people, almost, I would say, is the type of people who is easy to rule. I mentioned on Twitter the other day, I saw a picture from an Extinction Rebellion, the radical environmental group in London. They were naked, no idea why, and they were holding a placard that says, "We are vulnerable. We're all vulnerable." And I thought, A, it's weird that vulnerability is now this existential situation, but also, you're basically pleading to the powers to be, come and rule us. Because if you're vulnerable, you're telling, I need to be taken care of.
Protect me, save me.
Yeah, save me. And the same if you have, similar if you have guilt. If you have guilt, you're saying, I'm not good enough.
Save me from myself.
Remember
I need to be ruled.
Remember Reardon. Why can't Reardon take, for a big part of the book, the last step to say, the hell with all of you, I'm going to live my life? Because he feels guilt. It's like, who am I?
Still has accepted that unearned guilt.
Exactly. And this is what makes him rulable to the extent that he's rulable. He's not rulable, but even to this small extent, that's what makes him sign the certificate. He feels guilt. And then, of course, he corrects the mistake.
And frankly, if I look at most political and moral movements that came out of European culture, they induce unearned guilt. They induce unearned guilt. The fact that you're taking up space in this planet is the problem. What is your place? What is your role? Who are you to serve? What is your function in this corporate platonic body society? So many ideas, collectivist ideas from Europe, say just exactly that and induce unearned guilt, not to mention Christianity, which induces all manner of unearned guilt from day one. And even in the more secular parts of Europe, that moral code has not been rejected.
And first of all, shout out to Ayn Rand for the term academia jet set coalition. I love that. It's so much more
liberals, right? Yeah,
it's so much more relevant today. And the final point, the philosophy we need is the conceptual equivalent of American sense of life. So take this sense of life and make it explicit. So, James, final thoughts before we go to the final question that I want to ask you.
Well, just real briefly, since Ayn Rand wrote 50 years ago now, I think I've seen some very distressing things about the American sense of life. The line Ayn Rand had about defiance being the American reaction to overbearing authority. I just watched half of my fellow Americans perfectly willing to go along with COVID authoritarian detailed regulations everywhere, and that was very distressing. The fact that there were some protests against it shows me that there is some kind of American sense of life left. But on the other hand, to look at it positively, Ayn Rand has made tremendous progress in recent decades. Her popularity continues unabated. Intellectual defenses of her grow in number all the time. The great work we're doing here, I think, for example. So Ayn Rand has provided, in effect, the vital missing link that she was talking about.
And this is close to the question that I want to ask. It's actually Robert's question. So Robert, thank you for that super chat. So the question is, what is that it? Don't let it go. What is that it in 2021? What does it look like? What is the thing that we shouldn't let it go? So, or put differently, what is the sense of life today?
That's a hard thing to always put your finger on because it does depend upon the dominant ideas. But when I look at how the culture, especially of the young, has been affected recently, I would say that it is much worse than when Ayn Rand wrote. It is as though the difference between intellectuals and the American people, which Ayn Rand talked about, this great dichotomy, has been collapsing. And you can see it more and more and more in the effect on young people and their belief that their opposition to free speech, their belief that violence is okay, their opposition to, you can look at some of these radical violent groups, Antifa, Black Lives Matter as an organization, and some of them, they're opposed explicitly to objectivity, individualism, private property. Wow. They know who the enemy is, Ayn Rand, I think, at this point. But that's the thing. It's a battle between the ideas that underlie the sense of life. And so the only way we are going to resist letting go of the American sense of life is by developing a better philosophy and defending that sense of life by the ideas that really are the only ideas that can really justify it.
Robert, thank you so much for the extra super chat. And he says, it, the thing that we don't let go, is alive and well in many, many Americans. But too many of us can't name it explicitly. And that leaves us vulnerable. Keep up the good work naming it, the sense that the individual matters, his life is sacred. Robert, thank you so much. Yes. And it's exactly what you said. We need to make it explicit. And sometimes this is going to bring us in a difficult situation. So, for example, it might mean in the UK that you'll have to say, no, I'm not proud for the NHS. It's not our NHS. And actually, it's immoral. You have to say, I mean, you don't go, you don't enter a room and you say, you have to bring some context, bridge the code. But at some point, you have to make explicit these principles. And even more, if you defend them on a central political level, or on the level of an intellectual activist or intellectual leader, you have to name them. Let me give the exact opposite. Libertarian Party campaign in 2016, where they said, we don't want to be the party who is going to say that you can exclude people from your bar because of their color, of the color of their skin. Okay, so what you're saying is we have some vague principles, but we're not, whatever works for you, we're not going to make them explicit. So no, you have to make them explicit because otherwise they're going to be lost. So I don't know if it was a good example, but that's what came to my mind at this moment when I thought about making things explicit. James, thank you very much for being with us. So if you appreciate James, I don't want to say talent because it's the result of work, but ability to take these ideas and simplify them, you should see him in action on the Saturday peak, of course. So it might be worth becoming a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK and having access to these discussions on the peak of courses. We're finishing Objectives to Induction, which was one that we really really enjoyed. If you become a member, you get, in retrospect, access to previous courses, and it's something that I definitely encourage you to do. So today, in 9 p.m. UK time, which is 1 hour from now, solving the mind-body problem with Lee Pearson on the series The Cutting Edge. So there's always something happening in ARC UK, another reason why you should support us. James.
You guys are doing the most exciting intellectual work in objectivism and bringing the most important new work of objectivist intellectuals to a wide audience. So we all owe you guys a profound debt of gratitude.
Thank you. And we owe, because we are students of the movement, we owe gratitude to people like you and people like our mentors and teachers in ARI and in the Objectivist Academic Center, because that's how we learn and that's how we manage to try to make these things simpler. First of all, for us to understand, but also to help our audience understand. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, James. See you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.